Good afternoon from Scotland. My name is Mick Napier and I'm speaking on behalf of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Welcome to one of our fairly regular Sunday afternoon discussions with people we think have something significant to add to the struggle for effective solidarity with the beleaguered people of Palestine. We make no apologies for joining you a little bit earlier today. A big welcome to Huwaida Arraf from Detroit. Huwaida, is that right?
Yes.
We're really delighted to have Huwaida with us for reasons I'll explain in a minute, but especially since I believe she's struggling with two young kids on a Sunday morning, and it's a bit uncivilized to ask you to come on at 10 a.m. on a Sunday morning, Huwaida. So special thanks to you.
I'm happy to be with you.
Huwaida is a Palestinian American, or an American Palestinian, she'll tell you which, born in America to Palestinian parents, co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement, a practicing lawyer, focusing on human rights law, about which more in a minute or two. What else can I add? That really ticks all the boxes, Huwaida. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Huwaida, things are ratcheting up here in the UK. The Elbit protesters have been put in jails for just a few days at a time at the moment. Up here in Scotland, we have a record of state repression of Palestine solidarity campaigners for racism and other charges which were thrown out of court by sheriffs once they heard the evidence. In America, I think you've got a much harsher regime in terms of state repression of Palestine solidarity activists. Before we talk about the International Criminal Court, Huwaida, what's the big news? Either defeats or victories from your side of the pond for Palestine solidarity activists?
Well, over here, it's been a mix politically and legally, but I'm happy to report that legally, it's been a win. Win-win, and that's generally what we see. On the political level, we have the repression that is put forth and that is really funded and pursued by Zionists here, and they have the ability to manipulate really or just push through legislation that is fundamentally unconstitutional according to the US Constitution, but they get them through. And then when we are able to challenge these in court, we have, I actually cannot think of a time where we've lost in recent history challenging the, it's been a positive in that respect, because when we challenge the essence of what they're trying to sue us on, the courts find that they've been unconstitutional. Most recently, just a couple of weeks ago, a very good friend won her case against a former Israeli soldier. And she was born and raised in the United States, but decided to move over to Israel and join the Israeli military. The Israeli military propped this woman up and used her really kind of as propaganda on their website to promote the Israeli military. And then when my friend posted about her on Facebook and contrasted her status with the status of a young Palestinian medic, Razan al-Najjar, who was murdered in Gaza, the woman ended up suing for defamation. And, on top of suing my friend for a Facebook post, suing her for defamation, she tried to, or her attorneys tried to, get the US courts, this was in California state court, to apply Israeli law to the case.
I read that. That's quite incredible, isn't it?
On two different levels. One, to bypass the statute of limitations, because she was really late, over a year late in filing this lawsuit, and therefore she had no case. But also, making the argument that Israeli law on the statute of limitations should apply and the case should go forward. And on top of that, the court should apply Israeli substantive law, which is much harsher in cases of defamation, in order, and actually can exact a jail time, criminal punishment.
You're a lawyer, you know these things. Do you know any other examples in any legal jurisdiction of any state asking for their legal, apart from colonization, colonies, asking for their legal system to be applied? Norway to ask for it to be applied in Lithuania, God knows where else. Is this unique?
It's not completely unique, though. For example, in the United States, you can, different states, all of the different states can sometimes apply for or apply different state law depending on which state is more impacted, which state has a higher reason for having its own state apply. This is most usually seen when we're talking between states in the United States. The application of the law of a foreign country is extremely rare. I can't even think of a time where it was used. But on top of that, even when lawyers generally say that the substantive law of another state should apply, the law that has to do with the actual procedural matters, in this case, the statute of limitations, that is almost always the law of the forum state where you are suing. And so it was doubly audacious for them to say, you know, bypass precedent and apply Israeli law in procedural matters. And then on top of that, apply a law that could put your US California citizen in jail, even though in the United States, it would not mean jail time.
Oh, wait, let me bring you back to what you just said in, your opening remarks. I think it's very, very, and I think it's also the case here. You're saying that in the USA, the First Amendment still carries some weight, it's still significant, but when you get the pro-Israel lobby into courtroom where they can be cross-examined, where they can be questioned, the idea that you're a Jew-hating, terrorist-loving, whatever, can be challenged and you can win. So you generally win when you get them into court. Is that right?
We do generally win on, for example, in this case, it was definitely win. And it was a win not only because the judge said that Israeli law doesn't apply, but he also analyzed what they were suing my friend on, and basically a Facebook post that had to do with a matter that was of public interest in the public domain. And they admitted, the soldier in this case, they admitted that my friend was a social media activist and therefore was posting according to her First Amendment right to post. And so the judge significantly said what she was doing was exercising her First Amendment right to free speech. And then what he did was grant her request to find this action, the fact that they even brought this case against her, an effort to stifle free speech, and therefore slapped her with having to pay for the legal costs of my friend. So not only did they lose their case, but now they are burdened with covering all of the legal costs because the judge found this to be a deliberate effort to try to stifle political action and free speech, which about half the states in the United States have laws against that, lawsuits in order to specifically target it at stifling free speech. So that was a win. And then, other wins, another one that was most recent is fighting this anti-BDS legislation in the United States. Shamefully, we have in the United States, 30 states, 30 out of the 50 right now that have laws on the books that exact punitive repercussions really for engaging in boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And what we see, none of them, to the best of my knowledge, exact any kind of criminal or repercussions, but they do try to disincentivize those that would join boycott, divestment, and sanctions. What is the most prevalent, what we see in the different legislations of the different states are different, but what they end up saying generally is that when you are contracting with a state, if you have to certify, basically sign that you are not engaged in the boycott of Israel. And that is the only, you can be engaged in any other boycott. You can boycott the United States, you can boycott, but you cannot be engaged in a boycott of Israel. And that's what a lot of the state laws say. Most recently, this was what went to court was a case in Arkansas. A a newspaper, lost its contract with the state university. The state university used to put ads in the paper, which was a significant source of revenue for this paper. And then when they were renewing their contract, the editor of the paper saw that he was required to sign that he is not engaged in any kind of boycott of Israel and will not be engaged in any kind of boycott of Israel for the duration of the contract. And he didn't have any, interest one way or the other. The paper, according to him, has never really published an editorial one way or the other taking a position, but he definitely found this objectionable in that they were trying to stifle political speech in that way, and therefore he challenged it. He took it to court, and the first level court threw the case out. There was an appeal, and the appellate court agreed that the lower case was wrong. This statute is a violation of the First Amendment.
Look out behind you. Look out behind you.
This is my daughter, Mayada, a budding activist.
Yeah.
So that was a win also at the appellate level, them saying that it was a violation of the Constitution. And all of the cases that have been challenged in court, all of the anti-BDS cases have been found to be unconstitutional, the legislation itself. Now, why we haven't challenged all of the cases, it's only been a handful of states so far, and that's because, you're looking for a plaintiff that is directly affected in order to be able to challenge it in court. So I have no doubt that when there are plaintiffs in every state and these are challenged, they will be found to be unconstitutional.
Perhaps we need to tell some viewers in the UK and elsewhere how grotesque it can be. The bizarre story of Texas town Dickinson, where after it was leveled in a hurricane and a flood, they all received letters to say that they would only get aid to repair their ravaged homes if they undertook personally never to boycott Israel. Is there an element here of this sort of Zionist megaphone thing where, the academic boycott starts off with a tiny number of people in a room somewhere issuing a manifesto to boycott Israel, and then you get 5,000 academics in America supporting Israel, which publicizes the academic boycott and allows it to grow. Is there any element of that in the thing you're talking about?
Definitely, you see when the other side is making a big deal out of it, it might blow up to be something bigger than it would have otherwise been. But in this case, I think that there is such a grassroots support behind this that I think it would have been a big deal regardless. Because the work that's being done is, again, kind of very local, people reaching out and educating their local communities, taking it to their unions, to their place of work, to their places of worship, and making the case for why we have to act as civil society to do something when the when states that are supposed to uphold and protect human rights, as far as they say, aren't doing anything and have been granting Israel impunity, specifically in the United States, but all around the world. As probably all of your listeners know, the United States is the main backer of Israel, and United States taxpayers are paying for this, whether they like it or not. And therefore, we have an extra responsibility on top of that. So the fact that it is such a grassroots effort, I think, is very significant and is the main source and main reason that it has grown. But then we do see that Israel has taken this very seriously, has dedicated entire departments, within its government and military to combat this. And we have the, traditional big money backers of Israel, like the late Sheldon Adelson and others that devoted millions of dollars to fighting BDS. So that certainly brings extra attention to it.
Talking about millions of dollars, what's happened to the bill making its way through the US Congress, which would have slapped a £1 million price tag on your forehead as a BDS campaigner? It was the possibility of 10 years in your wonderful prison system. Is that still making its way through, or is it stalled?
No, that one did not pass. And that one, we had not only the traditional advocates for Palestinian rights, but, we had the American Civil Liberties Union that really took up this case and has been taking up other cases of BDS or anti-BDS legislation, and pointing out to members of Congress just how unconstitutional this is, not only stifling free speech, but criminalizing it in this way. And so that one did not pass. And there have since been other efforts.
Sorry, has it been killed? Has it been stalled, finished?
Yeah, that one is up, but there are other iterations of it that finally what did pass, let me say, is basically a statement from Congress saying that they oppose BDS.
Huwaida, you've touched on popular support, trade unions, campaign groups, anti-racism groups, and so on. Black Lives Matter. What's your relationship as a BDS movement in the broadest terms to the Black Lives Matter movement in the USA?
There is a strong solidarity between these movements and very different ones, which have been just strengthened with the last 4 years that we've had of Donald Trump, and just the veracity of the oppression that was meted out against various communities here in the United States. So that caused it to grow, but solidarity between Black activists and Palestine goes back to the 60s, and Palestinian really engagement and solidarity with third world movements for liberation. And that was also strong in the United States. We see the Black Panther movement had a very strong relationship also with Palestinians. That waned in the late 80s, and specifically with the signing of the Oslo Accords in the 90s, when the Palestine Liberation Organization in and of itself, unfortunately, transformed its focus from one of liberation to one of state building when we didn't have a state, and it became mired in uplifting kind of the United States and its role, put all of its eggs in the U.S.'s government's basket, looking to the U.S. to deliver liberation. And in that change of focus, there was also kind of a neglect of the kind of solidarity that was there and that needed to only grow. This combined also with the repression of Black activists in the United States. But now with the resurgence, and even before Donald Trump, there has been a growth and an understanding, and that has been put forth by and strengthened with different actions of, for example, one of the organizations that I serve on the board of, Eyewitness Palestine, which takes delegations to Palestine, for over a decade now, been taking also Black activists, immigration activists, indigenous activists to Palestine to strengthen that kind of solidarity. And so here we've seen, for example, the Movement for Black Lives, when it put out a manifesto of demands, included divesting from Israel and called Israel's actions genocide. And so there has been no qualms about calling things out for what they are. Palestinians also have been showing up for our Black sisters and brothers and need to continue to do so. And so I think that that's only strengthening, and it's a beautiful thing. It needs to continue here and all around the world, because what is oppressing one people is very much tied to what is the system that is oppressing.
Absolutely, absolutely. Look, before we come back to I'm really interested in this conversation, but I better tap into your legal expertise specifically. But before I do so, Scottish PSC is very much committed and active in the Stop the JNF campaign internationally and in the UK. The South Africans do fantastic stuff to publicise the crime scene underneath the South Africa. We are campaigning against the British part, and with the villagers whose property lies beneath the British part, Ajur and Zakaria and so on. Who can we reach out to deal with the Coretta Scott King Forest, which is a JNF forest in Israel, Palestine, which tries to co-opt the illusion of progressiveness of anti-racism for the racist state? How could we publicize that side to see who wants to take on that issue and tell the story of the crime scene that is the Coretta Scott King Forest? It's a JNF forest, and what came before it, and how we can get Americans to oppose that, Black people especially.
Yeah, I think that we should definitely talk about this to see if you've, there is the King Center here in the United States, which definitely should be contacted. I don't know if they have already, but we have, I think, a number of organizations that would be happy to partner with you on that, specifically in raising some opposition to something as ugly as what Israel has been doing it, and then trying to name it after, a prominent civil rights leader like the Coretta Scott King and other. So if you want me to rattle them off now.
No, I just want you to raise it with you. We can carry on this. Sorry, I'm exploiting you shamelessly. I wanted to talk about legal issues.
I think that's very significant. I don't know if, I know that there have been organizations here that have before challenged the nonprofit status of the JNF and others, but whether they have taken from the angle that you're talking about now, I'm not exactly sure. I'd be happy to look into that with you, and then also brainstorm about the numerous organizations that we have here that would probably be happy to work on that.
But back to the law. Here in the UK, the state is stepping up repression. Down in England, I think we were to the fore up here in Scotland for a while with trials of SPSC members for racism, quite shocking things, for saying the words "end the siege of Gaza." When we protested shortly after Operation Protective Edge, while the blood was still flowing basically in Gaza, because we had a symbol on a placard with blood saying this company profits from the occupation of Palestine, we were accused of a medieval blood libel against Jews. It's preposterous. The people carrying the placards didn't even know about the history of the blood libel against Jews. It's getting preposterous. Let me tell you one more thing, if I may, before asking you your opinion. We had a meeting here with Omar Barghouti and Ronnie Casrils, and then the day after our meeting in Edinburgh, a big meeting, they did the same thing in SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies, maybe it was LSE, down in London. And some idiot Zionist in the audience kept interrupting, but banal stuff. So one of the Jewish communists, I think, in the audience shouted out, "Do you really believe that? Do you really believe that?" he shouted. The BBC News website for 24 hours carried a story that this was an anti-Semitic diatribe. Do you really believe that? Jew really, because you highlighted two words. Luckily, we had the record of the event, and they had to withdraw it. It's becoming grotesque, isn't it? I mean, you can hardly say anything. I'm terrified to ask somebody if there's a bus Jew, because you're going to end up in court. Yeah, it is really worrying, and to the extent also that the mainstream media goes along with it and amplifies these claims that really don't have a basis. In the United States, one of the things that we're fighting, and I know in other countries too, that are moving towards adopting what the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance is trying to put forward, this new definition of anti-Semitism, which would include various forms of criticizing Israel. So they are trying to conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, which of course Zionists have been trying to do for decades. But now with the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance putting forward this new definition, formally, and getting countries and institutions to adopt this new definition that would formally recognize criticism of Israel as being anti-Semitic is very, here in the United States, the Trump administration certainly signaled its acceptance of this, and the Biden administration, which there is a lot of pushback on now, but has also verbally signaled approval of this definition. And what it would do would really hamper the academic freedom, because where this would definitely or most visibly be applied is in academic institutions that get
what we call here Title VI funding, but funding for certain institutions. Now, if there is any claim then that is made by any student or anybody in that this institution has behaved in an anti-Semitic way because maybe they had a presentation on Israel violence and Operation Cast Lead or something like that, then the institution would be investigated and their funding be threatened. So this is extremely, extremely dangerous. It hasn't been implemented yet, but all we've seen, unfortunately, from the Biden administration is sounding approval for adopting this, and it would, be disastrous in many different ways. And I know that other countries have also indicated that they are moving to adopt this definition, and it's something that we have to fight. Luckily, here in the United States, we have some of the organizations that have really most prominently taken up the fight have been Jewish organizations, for example, If Not Now and Jewish Voice for Peace have been at the forefront of fighting against the adoption of this, of this definition, and not only because of its effect on free speech and academic freedom, but also because it really it harms the fight, the real fight against anti-Semitism, which is very much entwined with, anti-racism and anti-everything that discriminates. And that is a fight we need to be taking up here all together, fighting white supremacy, fighting the racism against immigrants and Black and brown people. And when you exceptionalize anti-Semitism in this way and attribute to it things that aren't anti-Semitic at all, but are the legitimate forms of criticism, you really harm the real fight against anti-Semitism. And that is also dangerous to us all.
Look, you're throwing off so many interesting topics here. I'm just, my head's going to blow off soon. But a couple of things I wanted to ask you, Huwaida, because it's dead exciting, I think. After the atrocious massacre in the Pittsburgh synagogue, a bloody killer of Arabs came over to offer solidarity and solace to some of the survivors. I was very impressed by David Simon. Is David Simon, the guy behind The Wire, the playwright for The Wire, which is, I just think it's the best thing that's ever appeared on a television screen anywhere. But he took Netanyahu to task, and he partly blamed the Israelis for the Pittsburgh massacre, but partly by saying, you work night and day to foist Trump onto us. Trump has given massive encouragement to white supremacists, and now we see Jewish corpses here in Pittsburgh, just as you see, Muslim corpses in New Zealand. How exceptional is that? Is that awareness beginning to spread among some sections of the Jewish and other population? Or I don't want to exaggerate it, but it's an absolutely wonderful synthesis, and to be aware of that.
It is. Is it beginning to spread? You mean specifically that the actions of Israel specifically are contributing to anti-Semitism?
Yeah, via Trump and via other things, yeah.
Well, it's an important point that you make, that Trump and Netanyahu were like best friends. One of the things that, I don't know if I've as much seen that correlation being made and that realization widespread, but one of the things that we definitely witnessed during the 4 years of Trump is that mainstream media even was willing to be more critical of Netanyahu and Israeli policies because of Trump's adamant support for them, because Trump was so obnoxious and so destructive in his policies here that the mainstream media wasn't as reserved, let's say, in also criticizing the actions abroad. And this is so this was a positive, actually, unfortunately, I hate to say that, of the Trump administration, in that mainstream media kind of stepped out of its traditional box. For example, when Trump recognized Israel, Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moved the embassy, there was a significant amount of criticism in mainstream media here, which is something we would have never seen and hadn't seen before. And it's something, unfortunately, that is going to be, I think, muted now in the era of the Biden administration, because the Biden administration thus far has not shown that it's too different on policies. And really it's not, because this is a history of US policy towards Israel and Palestine that was just amplified by Trump, but not necessarily Trump didn't diverge in any significant way. He just kind of voiced and acted more quickly on things that the United States has been doing all along. And Biden is intent on reversing some of that, but taking us back to the status quo is just taking us back to a time where we continue, I'm sorry, I don't even want to say we, but the United States continues to support Israel in the various ways that it does, but not in Trump-like fashion. And therefore, when the Biden administration moves forward and does certain things that continue to harm Palestinians, unfortunately, I think we will not see the mainstream media criticize it as much as they would have, or they did under Trump. For example, Biden has said that he's not going to move the US embassy back to Tel Aviv. I haven't heard a peep about this in the media that criticized Trump for moving the embassy to Jerusalem.
So underneath the grotesquerie of Trump and Adelson-Netanyahu axis, there's still this fundamental strategic alliance, isn't there, that will weather these storms, and Biden will be completely committed to it. So there's still a need. The need for international solidarity has not reduced, you would argue, Huwaida. What about law? You go to court, you've won some. Why don't we just put all our efforts into legal fighting? Sort of play down the need for mass mobilization, non-violent direct action. Let's persuade the guys and the gals in the courtrooms. Persuade them that there's something terrible happening in Palestine. How would you respond to that argument? It's often implicit, but it's there from liberals.
Well, there is a limit to what you can challenge in court in terms of policies. For example, we can't challenge the US foreign policy in court for the most part, because we wouldn't have standing to do that. And therefore, the fact that the United States gives Israel $3.8 billion that goes to the Israeli military per year, we can't go into court and challenge that. According to US legal system, we wouldn't have standing to do that. And other elements of foreign policy that US citizens would not have standing to do. And therefore, in terms of the most visible and the most substantial ways in which different governments support Israel, I think average citizens could not challenge it in court. What we can challenge in court is the various obstacles that are put in our way when we try to mobilize to educate the public, do widespread education. Because when we do that, this widespread education, and then move that into mobilization, hopefully that translates to educating, mobilizing, pressuring our elected representatives that are making the laws. And so when we can get some of the laws changed that allow this to happen, I think we will begin to see a change. And in the United States, over the past few years, we've seen a growing number of elected representatives that are not afraid to speak out against Israel. And this was, I think, really highlighted with Bernie Sanders, Senator Bernie Sanders, a former presidential candidate who did not, the first really presidential candidate to refuse to appear at an AIPAC conference, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and which candidates don't do. They never turned down AIPAC, and he did. He didn't go, and he was not hurt in the polls by it. His popularity only continued to grow, and therefore, simultaneously, it's not, I don't think one really affected the other, but certain members of Congress that are also being elected, not only because they're not afraid to speak out on Israel-Palestine, but because of their popular base and because of their promotion of more progressive politics, because of the representation of a younger generation of US citizens that do want the more just policies. It is encouraging. And we've had just in the last week, 3 different letters to Congress on the issue of Palestine. 3 different letters from members of Congress that went to the administration, the State Department, asking them to look into and to act on Israeli policies that are harming Palestinians. And that is really unprecedented in the United States. So a long way of answering your question, there are some things we can fight in the court, but some things that we can't in terms of policy that is supporting Israel, but we can continue to mobilize. And then when they try to shut us down using the law, we can fight that.
So do I hear you say that there's all sorts of things that are out of bounds in terms of legal challenge, but when they repress the BDS, the Palestine Solidarity Movement, then it becomes a free speech issue. Are we going back to the Vietnam War when the free speech movement in Barclay, because it responded to the repression by fighting back, raised the whole, I mean, I'm old enough to have been involved in the Vietnam Solidarity campaign. And the free speech movement changed everything. I mean, meetings were modest, but after they tried to repress and say no more meetings on the Vietnam War allowed on campus, it kind of blew up. I really think that we need to fuse the issue of Palestine with the issue of free speech in order to break out into a wider audience. So what do you think about the argument? And I hear very impressive Palestinian comrades argue this. The sort of Zionist pushback is there to take us away from BDS. Just ignore it. Carry on, BDS, nothing else. Liberals also feel deeply disappointed that the BBC reveals itself as a state broadcasting corporation. But given that it's unavoidable, an anti-colonial solidarity movement has always been repressed, shouldn't we not exactly welcome it, but shouldn't we see it as an opportunity to fuse Palestine solidarity with free speech?
I definitely think it's an opportunity, because you are going to be able to reach people that you wouldn't otherwise reach by pointing out the fact that look how obnoxious they're getting in their scare tactics and their attempts to silence us. They don't even want us to speak. And some people will mobilize and will stand with you on that issue, whereas they wouldn't when it comes to the substance, because for a variety of reasons. And like I mentioned earlier, one of the organizations that undertook and that has been at the forefront really of the legal fight against anti-BDS legislation in the United States is the American Civil Liberties Union, which is the largest really civil liberties organization in the United States. And they don't take a position on BDS, but they have determined that this legislation is an affront to constitutional rights. And when there are when these things get challenged, or there is an opportunity to challenge them in court, the ACLU has been involved. And I think that also translates to not only organizational support, but your ability to get certain people that, again, wouldn't otherwise listen, that will listen. So I don't, I can see the argument, okay, let's not get sidetracked, but I think we can do both. I think that we can fuse the issue and also try to not get sidetracked by continuing our organizational work. That is certainly very important. But it brings up another point I just want to briefly mention. And the Israeli lawfare efforts, kind of what we're calling them here, their ability to use the law to silence us, or their attempts to use the law to silence us in the United States, is a very deliberate intent, not to necessarily win on the law, but to certainly sidetrack and instill fear in activists so that they silence themselves. And this has been stated in so many words by the ones that are behind this lawfare, because they know that they have unlimited funds. In one of the organizations that is always involved when you look at cases against Palestinian activists is an organization that has ties to the Israeli military and government and has virtually unlimited funding. And so when you have that money and you have the apparatus, when you go after activists, students that don't have, the funding necessarily and are generally looking for pro bono legal representation, that we're talking about students that then are going to want to get into, find a job after school, etc. To threaten someone with all of this power coming against you to silence you, one, you definitely distract and get someone tied up with trying to fight this legal challenge. And then for other activists that are looking at this might think twice and against, like I said, silence themselves. So it's a definite tactic that is being used that we should be aware of.
And when we win, it inspires other people.
Yeah,
we had arms factories smashed up in Derry, supplying Israel, arms factories during Pritev smashed up in Brighton, and the judge making a speech that I wish I had written, that you would wish you had written. And the accused were acquitted. It was wonderful. So we all rise on those ties. Robin asks, did the Israeli lobby retaliate against the judge who ruled against their client requesting application of Israeli law? Is there a pushback once the judge takes a position against judges?
So far we haven't seen anything. So, and I think that probably be limited in what they can do. I think and the judge definitely took his time in articulating, his opinion. At first, he issued like a preliminary opinion, and then they had oral argument. And then he took almost a month after, even though he had a preliminary opinion that found, for the Palestinian activists, he took almost a month after that to issue the actual opinion, because I think he made sure that he was on solid legal ground, that if there was an appellate, an appeal, that he would not be overturned. And then I think that that's, credit due to him. We have not noticed anything yet. That's not to say that it won't come, but nothing yet.
Huwaida, let me give you a late Christmas present or Hanukkah present or whatever. The trial in Brighton, they smashed up the factory, threw computers out the window, £250,000 worth of damage, went to trial. They moved to trial. They were learning from Derry during the invasion of Lebanon. They just repeated the script. In fact, when you tell the two stories, people think you're repeating yourself needlessly. But it went to trial, and they brought in a judge to make sure they would get a conviction. The problem is he had been born in Haifa during the mandate, and he was a bit of a maverick. Anyway, during the trial, he basically said to the jury, summing up, you may think these people deserve a medal for their bravery. I want you to follow this very seriously, scolding, this is a matter of law. I don't want you to be influenced by any sense of shame at the role of the British government in arming Israel. And he went, I kid you not, I mean, we took the transcript of what he said and made it a pamphlet. It was so good, right? I'll send you a copy. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, it was wonderful. So the Zionists went crazy afterwards, and he got a small, but he was retired anyway. So how do we, Huwaida, sum up? We have to do the forensic stuff in court. We have to respond to the lawfare. But by the way, before the next question, do you see lawfare as really the Zionists lost the debate? They can't cope with the debate. They've nothing to contribute to a debate about what's happening in Israel. Therefore, they want to silence the debate through lawfare. I think that's not far from it, is it?
I think that is hitting the nail on the head there. I think that's true. And when it comes to, they've invested millions, if not billions by now, in propaganda, in talking points and pamphlets and training the ambassadors and student ambassadors to just regurgitate certain statements that really don't stand up to any kind of scrutiny. And I think that they've noticed that these are not standing up, and the movement for Palestinian rights is growing around the world. Specifically, in the US, we've seen I just lost my train of thought there, but we see it growing. I was going to mention, even on the political level, the latest polls taken within, for example, the Democratic Party. Democratic Party now here in the US, which is also traditional, just like the Republican Party has been pro-Israel, and the average civilians, the average people, what they're subjected to in terms of rhetoric from elected representatives, from the media, also cause them to be or lean towards Israel. And we can see that, most stark is Rachel Corrie's parents, Cindy and Craig, when they talk about what they knew before Rachel went over to Palestine, They said we weren't big here or there, but we leaned more pro-Israel because that's a lot of what we heard. But now, obviously, they're huge advocates for Palestinian rights because of what they know. But now, recent polls will show that most voters in the United States support Palestinian rights. And not only that, are also favor sanctioning Israel for violating.
You're talking about majorities here.
Majorities. And now the majority is greater in the Democratic Party. Across the United States, it's a slight majority in favor of taking a neutral stance or or supporting Palestinian rights, and then on top of that, a majority that would support sanctioning Israel for violation of Palestinian rights. And I think one of the latest polls was taken back when there was a lot of talk about Israel, but just back last summer, of formally annexing more territory of Palestine. So
you couldn't ask for much better in terms of campaigning. I mean, that's a massive audience predisposed to listen to you. Campaigners can't ask for much else, can they?
And we tried to use that. I was this past summer a delegate for Bernie Sanders to the National Democratic Convention, and we tried to influence the Democratic Party platform in terms of language. It's not horrible. There's some improvement in it, but there's still a lot to be desired in terms of the formal platform. For example, it says it's opposed to the expansion of Israeli settlements as opposed to saying it opposes all of Israeli settlements. And so we tried to get these minor changes and pointed out that the majority of the American people support this, and a majority of the Democratic Party, the base of the Democratic Party, wants this. And it was shut down. There was almost zero debate, and we're told, this is not firsthand information, but it was Biden himself that kind of stepped in and shut this down, not allow any of our amendments to pass. So we still have a lot of work to do on that level.
Well, I've got 101 questions I'd like to ask you, but I know you have to be somewhere else, Huwaida. Do you want to make some closing remarks about the relationship between legal fighting and public campaigning?
Yes, maybe a few things, and thank you for
I never even asked you about the International Criminal Court. We'll have to leave that for another day. I hope we can get you back.
Well, maybe I'll make a couple of small points about that. I appreciate you allowing me out a little bit early. I wish I could stay with you the whole time, but there is somewhere I have to be. I think legal campaigning, activism, or the legal work and the work in the streets go hand in hand. We won't win all the legal fights, but the more we educate and mobilize in the streets, I think that moves public opinion to the point where you are also having an effect in the courtroom. And so I think, and then as we talked about here, decisions in the courtroom on the legal level can give a boost to the activists that are organizing and mobilizing in the streets. So they go hand in hand. Let's not put all of our efforts here, all of our efforts there, but know how to use them. And the beautiful thing about that is that we have so many people involved in the movement for Palestinian freedom. And so that you have your lawyers that are willing to put in time, and you have your people in other professions that maybe always can't be in the streets, but are willing to devote their time to contribute. And we're all doing what we can when we can, right? And that's also something very important to keep in mind as activists, that we're taking care of ourselves and supporting each other so that we can do our best and give what we can towards this movement. It's not a short fight, it is a long one. And so we take care of ourselves and see strategically where we're at. In terms of the International Criminal Court, that certainly is, it has been the talk now. It's extremely significant. And when you're talking about Palestinians specifically, we've been talking these past 45 minutes about our ability to take our fights to court. Maybe we lose some, but we've been talking about some wins. Palestinians have not been able to do that. They and the victims and the thousands and thousands of Palestinian victims, from babies to 90-year-old great-grandparents, the loss of their lives or the injuries, no one has ever been held accountable for them. And when you just think about what it's like for the families of a victim to never have justice, to never be able to see the person that killed your loved one, or the system that is contributing to the oppression and murder, be put on trial, much less get convicted. Palestinian victims have never had that writ large. Certainly Palestinian courts cannot prosecute Israel or Israelis. The Israeli courts, for the most part, don't do it. And efforts to implement what's called universal jurisdiction. Most countries have universal jurisdiction laws, which are intended to go after the most heinous crimes, and universal jurisdiction laws say that even if this crime didn't happen in my jurisdiction, if the perpetrator comes into our country, we can assert jurisdiction and put them on trial because the crimes that they have committed are so heinous, and we all have a global responsibility to stop that. A lot of countries have that. Palestinians have tried to use that, and then the Zionist lobby have gone after the politicians to change those laws. In the UK, in Belgium, in Germany, even there's been some manipulation, so Palestinians were not able to use that. And through Palestinians have been campaigning the UN, implement your laws and hold Israel accountable, and even that has been shut down because, you know, while the UN will issue reports and things like that saying Israel is in violation, when it comes to any kind of implementation of the law, there's political will, and we know that the United States has been shut down any effective action. So the fact that the court is moving on it in the face of such extreme pressure, the office of the prosecutor has been put under a lot of pressure for all of these years that they've been investigating, and never came out recently and said, the office of the prosecutor in December 2019 said, you know, there is reason to believe that war crimes have been committed and that our office has jurisdiction. And then the office of the prosecutor asked the pretrial chamber for an opinion, also a legal opinion as to the jurisdiction of the courts. And in February 5th, we saw that opinion come down that said the court does have jurisdiction to investigate. And Israel tried all kinds of actions to quell that, and saying that the court is involving itself in politics. And the court addressed that, saying inherently all of this, any case that comes to the court is going to be about politics. Any case that they investigate where crimes are going to be committed, you know, you're talking about military officials, or you're talking about political officials, that there's going to be politics involved. We are not taking a political position. We are looking at the crimes that are being committed. So the court rejected Israel's argument that the court is getting involved in politics by taking up this decision. And now, just a couple of weeks ago, Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor, took that decision and decided that she's formally opening up an investigation. We thought that perhaps her term expires in June and there's a new prosecutor coming in. We thought there's a chance that they might not open an investigation even though we have these decisions, but she announced the opening of an investigation. And so now all 123 member states of the ICC are obligated to cooperate with the court in investigating. Of course, Israel is not a member state, the United States is not, and they will continue exerting pressure to try to get this shut down. And if I am going to leave you with an appeal to anyone that is listening, Europe is very important in this, because the Western European states are some of the biggest backers, let's say, of the court. They are all member states of the court for the largest part, and the biggest financial backers of the court. And that is part of the pressure that is going to be exerted on them to drop the case. That we've already heard some things coming out of Germany that they might not cooperate, and there are behind the scenes pressures. So as much as we can amplify this and stop the governments from doing this and let the court do its work, it is the way that Palestinians can have any justice. And it's not a biased investigation. The office of the prosecutor is investigating the situation in Palestine that includes Palestinian actions and Israeli actions, and it will be a thorough investigation. And if somebody needs to be held to account, they should be held to account with this without political interference.
Huwaida Arraf, thank you very much for joining us. You're pretty sharp for a Sunday morning where you are. Some of us have the advantage of being up for a while. Huwaida, thanks very much. That's been great. And I'll send you something about the Coretta Scott King Forest, and hopefully we can take that forward. A real pleasure. Thanks for joining us, Huwaida.
Thank you and your team and everyone for all you're doing. Thank you. Solidarity.
Cheers. Solidarity to you in the heart of the beast. Friends, Huwaida mentioned at the end the EU. It's very important. Even she may not know that in 2004, there was an opinion poll carried out of EU public opinion towards Israel, which revealed that people in every country in the EU viewed Israel as a major threat to world peace. Franco Frattini, the EU Foreign Affairs spokesman that year, apologized to Israel for these findings, our opinions, and vowed to Israel that these opinions would not be allowed to influence EU foreign policy towards Israel in the Middle East. So nobody else is coming to save the Palestinians. It will only be their own efforts and those of people like you and me around the world that will shift the balance against the apartheid state. We are the people we have been waiting for. Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign tries to fight here in our own little parish here in the north of the UK. Other people do the same elsewhere. Please get in touch. It's not difficult in the age of the internet. Help us. Financial donation is what we run on. More than the financial donation, we run on the energy and commitment of individuals who thirst for justice. Friends, thanks very much for joining us at this unusual time on a Sunday afternoon. The recording will be available shortly. Thank you. On behalf of Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, thanks for joining us.